Look, I don't know who needs to hear this today, but the United States military is not going to roll tanks up into Canada and successfully turn us into the 51st state. It is not going to happen. Do I think we have things to be concerned about from the Trump administration up here in Canada? Yes, I do. And it involves the normalization of the fascism that they're trying to push down there. It involves being exposed to propaganda. It involves the undermining of democratic norms that I worry could come up here as well. But tanks across the border, I don't think so. Now, you can't predict anything with 100% probability. It's not to say they might not try, but I do think there's enough smart people in the United States military for them to know it would be an absolute, total, and utter failure. And I am willing to stake my life savings on that. And here's why, okay? Counterinsurgency is really, really difficult. And if any military has learned that in the last 20 years, it's the American military. They tried in Afghanistan and they tried in Iraq, and it doesn't work. So I read this amazing article yesterday, this long form opinion piece. I'm going to put the link in the comments. And it was about how martial law will not be successful in the United States. And it was a very good breakdown of the capabilities of the United States military against what is required to maintain martial law. It's fascinating on its own, but it's a really relevant for the idea of coming into Canada as well. So in the article, he states that, and according to the American Counterinsurgency Manual for the military, that you need about 20 armed military personnel for every 1,000 civilians. The higher the resistance, the more you need. Now remember, Canada, like 90% of us are like, hell no, we don't want to be the 51st state. We would offer up a huge amount of resistance. And you can't underestimate that. We actually have a lot of guns in this country, a lot of people who know how to use them. We have a lot of anger that we would direct at it, and it would not be a walk in the park for the military. And they know that. I mean, let's not kid ourselves, right? The other thing that a lot of people don't factor in is when you go and to turn us into the 51st state is about maintaining long-term control over the territory. It's not just getting initial control, it's controlling all of it, the entire civil and social and political infrastructure that supports the functioning of the state. Think about it just a little bit. Do you really believe that it would happen? Do you really believe that enough Canadians would be like, yeah, whatever, that we wouldn't fight forever at that level? So, you can sabotage. I've talked about sabotage before. You sabotage the communications infrastructure, supply chain infrastructure. You resist and you resist and you resist, and it works. And that's why I don't think that the American military is, gung-ho about this idea of engaging Canada. The other thing is about militaries is the logistics, right? I think it would also fail on just a logistic front. So my understanding now is that the United States military is provisioned for overseas deployments. They are not provisioned for North American deployments. They don't have the logistical support here to invade, say, Canada. So when you first invade and you get that initial control through attack, you have to maintain that control, which means you have to stay, which means you have to be an occupying force, which means you have to be provisioned. You cannot provision an army from foraging and pillaging in the area because the resistance would never allow you to get enough to provision that army. You have to provision from the rear, okay? Now remember, if we're actually doing this and we're actually at war, all of the resources that flow from Canada down into the states that United States military uses, they are no longer flowing. The United States military is going to have to pass through territories where now there's no electricity because we shut that off. So let's be very clear about the logistical nightmare alone. And if you don't think logistics are important or that how much it costs to actually provision a military, I want to show you something. This is it's one of my favorite diagrams of all time. It's very, very famous. And this shows Napoleon's march through to Russia. One of the most spectacular military failures of all time. So this is where he starts. This is when he leaves France. He goes all the way to Moscow. Look how many people he loses along the way. Fails in Moscow because it's a large country, scorched earth, Russians retreated. There's also a lesson in there for Canada. And then they leave, and look at this. The temperature drops, the march gets long and long and long and long, and look at this. That little black sliver right there is what they end up with back in France compared to what they left with. This is a story not of military defeat by the enemy. This is a story of military defeat by lack of logistical planning. All those men died on the march back to France because they didn't have clothes, because they didn't have shelter, because it was freezing, and they died. They just died of exposure on the way. Logistics are important. You have to provision. Canada, similar to Russia, giant, huge. So not like the military, the American military wouldn't be able to concentrate itself, right? Because in order to get control, to turn us into the 51st state, you have to control the whole thing. You cannot leave pockets of resistance. You cannot leave a base for the resistance to grow and reestablish the country. From Vancouver, all the way across through Calgary and Saskatoon and Winnipeg, and then you come down and you've got the Rocky Mountains, you got all the water in Manitoba, and then you come into Ontario, the trees, and then it's like this huge amount of territory. Go through Quebec, same thing. New Brunswick is like solid tree. You get all the way like Halifax, you're dealing with all of that. And then you got Newfoundland, it's an island, Labrador, the north. You got a provision for all that kind of territory to hold control of it. Listen, the people who run the American military, okay, like they have to study a lot. They have to study a lot of military history, and they also have to learn from their mistakes. They know that it would be one of the stupidest decisions of all time to try to invade Canada. They may not outright refuse because things are tense and weird down there right now, but you don't think that they would just drag their heels and misdirect and stop that absolute disaster from unfolding? And even if it happened, and I know it wouldn't be pretty, and I'm not trying to minimize that, but it would never, ever be successful. So listen, like I said, we do have things to worry about. There are things happening down in the United States that are deeply problematic, and I definitely think that I don't want to minimize that. But I really think it's important for Canada and Canadians to focus on the actual threats. Tanks coming across the border and successfully turning us into the 51st state that's not the actual threat. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Otherwise, I hope everyone's doing okay today.